In September of 1943, 4 million soldiers converged on Europe's fourth longest river. The Germans called it their Eastern Wall, the impenetrable barrier that would halt the Soviet onslaught. But Field Marshal von Manstein already knew the horrifying truth. His armies were fleeing toward a mirage. The fortifications Hitler had promised were pure fantasy. What came next wasn't a battle. It was a 2,000-kilometer bloodbath that would rage for 60 days without mercy. More men would perish here than at Stalingrad and Kursk combined. The Dnieper would become the cemetery of German defensive strategy, the place where the Wehrmacht discovered they'd never stop running again. This is the story of how Hitler's final hope became Germany's ultimate catastrophe, how an entire army fled toward a salvation that never existed, and how a river meant to rescue the Third Reich instead drowned it in blood. July 1943, Kursk. The Wehrmacht gambled everything on one massive offensive called Operation Citadel. It was Hitler's desperate throw of the dice to reclaim momentum in the east. They failed completely. 500,000 German soldiers would never return home. Thousands of tanks, Tigers and Panthers and Ferdinand tank destroyers were reduced to burning wreckage in the Ukrainian wheat fields. The Luftwaffe hemorrhaged pilots faster than it could train replacements, and elite divisions that had steamrolled through France and Poland simply vanished from the order of battle. Germany's capacity for offensive warfare died in those blazing fields, but Stalin refused to pause, not for a single day and not for a single hour. On August 3rd, while German commanders were still tallying their catastrophic losses, 5 Soviet fronts surged forward. Nearly 4 million men advanced as one. More tanks than Germany could manufacture in an entire year thundered west. Their strategy was revolutionary in its brutal simplicity. They abandoned the elaborate encirclements that had characterized earlier Soviet campaigns. Instead, they'd just seize ground, fast and relentless. They'd deny the Germans any opportunity to regroup, to think, or to construct defenses. General Zhukov assembled his commanders and outlined the new doctrine. He told them to hunt the Germans. Don't let them catch their breath. Don't let them dig in. Every hour they flee, they weaken, and every kilometer we advance, we grow stronger. The calculus of war had shifted catastrophically against Germany. Soviet factories churned out 3 tanks for every German vehicle destroyed. T-34s rolled off Ural assembly lines every 4 hours. American Lend-Lease trucks, 400,000 of them, carried Soviet infantry forward at speeds the horse-drawn Wehrmacht couldn't hope to match. The Wehrmacht had no reserves remaining, nothing at all. The strategic reserve that had rescued them countless times before had been bled completely dry. A German officer named Major Klaus Becker wrote to his wife. He said they used to attack, but now they only flee. They used to choose their battlegrounds, but now they fight wherever the Soviets catch them. Intensity, medium. Colonel Hans von Luck watched the Soviet tide approaching and recorded in his diary that this isn't an army advancing anymore. It's a force of nature, like trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands. When Manstein studied his maps in early August, he saw catastrophe rolling toward him like a storm front. 5 massive red arrows were converging on his exhausted divisions. Each arrow represented a Soviet front, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and endless batteries of artillery. His Army Group South had nothing to stop them. No reserves concealed in the rear, and no fresh divisions waiting to plug the gaps. His only option was to retreat to the Dnieper and pray the promised fortifications actually existed. But even as his men began their desperate westward march, Manstein harbored a terrible suspicion. For 2 years, Hitler had forbidden any discussion of defensive positions in the east. Constructing fortifications meant acknowledging the Wehrmacht might retreat, and that was defeatist thinking, punishable by execution. Hitler inhabited a fantasy realm where every meter of conquered territory was sacred ground. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, surrounded by maps depicting divisions that no longer existed, He issued impossible commands to hold positions that had already fallen. Any general who proposed building defenses was branded a coward. Several were shot. But on August 11, 1943, with Soviet forces charging across Ukraine like wolves sensing wounded prey, Hitler finally issued the order: build the eastern wall along the Dnieper, make it impregnable, transform the river into a fortress that would shatter the Red Army. The order read like fantasy literature. It demanded concrete bunkers at 500-meter intervals, anti-tank obstacles to a depth of 10 kilometers, interlocking fields of fire, mines on every approach, and artillery positioned in hardened emplacements. Local commanders read the directive and laughed, or wept. Some did both. They had 6 weeks to construct what the Atlantic Wall had required 3 years to build. They had no concrete because the factories lay in ruins, no steel because every scrap went to tank production, and no engineers because they'd been slaughtered at Kursk, their bodies rotting in anti-tank ditches. Fritz Todt, the organizational genius who might have managed such a project, had perished in a mysterious plane crash. His replacement was a Nazi, party functionary who'd never built anything larger than a garage. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin called it building a castle out of sand while the tide rolls in. Another officer was more blunt. He said they'd been ordered to stop the Soviets with wishes and fairy tales. The reality proved worse than mere material shortages. The German construction battalions meant to build these fortifications were themselves in full retreat. The slave laborers who might have excavated trenches had fled or joined partisan bands. Manstein knew the truth. In his diary, he wrote that the Ostwall is fiction. We retreat toward nothing but a river and death. But he had no alternative. 2 million Soviets were hunting his men. They needed those fortifications to exist, even if only in their desperate imagination. Type, somber, intensity, medium. Hope, even false hope, was all that kept his soldiers moving. A staff officer remembered Manstein staring at the Dnieper on his map, tracing the river with his finger, and saying quietly that this is where the Reich dies. German soldiers marched toward the Dnieper, believing salvation awaited them. Their officers knew the truth, but remained silent. What purpose would it serve to tell exhausted men that their final hope was a lie? September 1943. The retreat degenerated into a race, then collapsed into a rout. Soviet tanks advanced 20 kilometers every single day. German infantry couldn't march that fast. Their feet bled through disintegrating boots. Horses collapsed and were abandoned to die, and trucks exhausted their fuel and were shoved into ravines. Men discarded everything: ammunition and food and weapons, even photographs of loved ones, just to move faster. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was dissolving like snow in rain. Manstein commanded scorched earth: burn everything, demolish every bridge, every railway line, and every building, poison every well, incinerate every grain silo, leave the Soviets nothing but ashes and corpses. German pioneer units executed the order with systematic brutality. They dynamited the massive Zaporizhzhia dam, and millions of tons of water engulfed Ukrainian farmland. Entire villages vanished beneath the flood. Thousands of civilians drowned in their homes. The Wehrmacht torched grain fields that could have sustained millions through the approaching winter. They butchered livestock and hurled the carcasses into wells. They transformed Ukraine into a wasteland. A Ukrainian survivor named Oksana Marchenko remembered that first they stole everything, then they burned everything, then they mined the ashes so we couldn't even search for food. But the Soviets never stopped coming. General Vatutin's tanks didn't halt for demolished bridges. His engineers erected new ones within hours using American-supplied equipment. General Konev's infantry didn't stop for incinerated villages. They carried their own supplies in endless convoys of Studebaker trucks. And General Rokossovsky hammered from the north like a forge, striking an anvil. Stalin had promised medals to whoever reached the Dnieper first. More than medals, glory and promotion, and their names immortalized in history. Soviet commanders raced each other toward glory, driving their exhausted men beyond human endurance. Tank crews operated for 20 hours straight, falling unconscious at their controls. Infantry marched until they collapsed, were loaded onto trucks, then marched again when they awakened. Meanwhile, German units were disintegrating into chaos. The 9th Panzer Division began the retreat with 100 tanks. By mid-September, they possessed just 12 operational vehicles. The 257th Infantry Division could account for only 2,000 men from an original 10,000. No one knew whether the rest were dead or captured, or simply lost in the vastness of the steppe. Sergeant Hans Müller kept a diary that survived the war. September 10th. Discarded my extra ammunition. Too heavy. September 12th. Abandoned the field kitchen. No fuel to tow it. September 14th. Left the wounded behind. God forgive us. September 15th. I see the Dnieper. Thank God. September 16th. There are no fortifications. We're all dead. The retreat spawned its own nightmares. German military police executed deserters, often just exhausted soldiers who'd fallen behind. Partisan attacks escalated daily. Every forest might conceal Soviet raiders, and every village might be a trap. The Wehrmacht wasn't an army anymore. It was a mob fleeing west. By September 20th, the first German units reached the river they believed would save them. What they discovered would annihilate the last remnants of hope. The first German soldiers to reach the Dnieper refused to believe their eyes. No bunkers, no trenches, no barbed wire, no minefields, and no artillery positions. Nothing. Just 3 kilometers of open water and naked riverbank, empty fields, a few Ukrainian fishing villages, abandoned and burned. The Eastern Wall, Hitler's impregnable barrier, the fortress that would annihilate the Red Army, didn't exist. It had never existed, and it would never exist. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote what would become his final letter home. He said they promised us fortifications, but we found dirt and water. We're dead men walking. The Dnieper was wide. Yes, 3 kilometers across in places. It was the 3rd largest river in Europe, flowing from Russia to the Black Sea. Under normal circumstances, it would have represented a formidable obstacle. But September 1943 brought the worst drought in decades. Water levels dropped to the lowest anyone could remember. Sandbars emerged where deep channels should have flowed. A determined man could wade across at dozens of points. The river meant to save Germany barely reached a tall man's chest in many stretches. Worse still, the Wehrmacht had destroyed their own bridging equipment during the retreat. Following standard doctrine, they demolished or abandoned their pontoon bridges to delay the Soviets. Now, they couldn't even cross to the western bank properly. German engineers swam across with ropes, constructing makeshift ferries under constant Soviet artillery bombardment. Men drowned attempting to stretch cables across the current. Type, helpless, intensity, high. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Baumann of the 72nd Infantry Division documented the scene. He said they arrived at their fortress to find nothing but mud. The men looked at him, waiting for orders. What could he say? Dig in with your helmets. Hold the river with rifles against tanks. He told them to scrape foxholes and pray. Within hours of the Germans arriving, Soviet reconnaissance units materialized on the eastern bank. They observed the same thing. No defenses. Just exhausted German soldiers attempting to dig fighting positions with their helmets and bare hands. Some Germans hadn't even crossed the river yet and were still milling on the eastern bank in confusion. Soviet scouts couldn't believe their fortune. One radioed back that the fascists have nothing, repeat, nothing, just men and rifles. He requested an immediate assault. The German soldiers understood they were doomed. A Wehrmacht corporal named Friedrich wrote in a letter discovered on his body that they ran 400 kilometers to reach safety. There is no safety, only a river we cannot defend. Mother, I won't see Christmas. Soviet commanders immediately ordered their forces to cross now, everywhere, before the Germans could organize even rudimentary defenses. September 22nd, 1943. 2 in the morning. Darkness shrouded the Dnieper. The first Soviet soldier slipped into the black water, then another, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The Red Army didn't wait for boats. Soldiers crossed on logs and doors wrenched from farmhouses and barn roofs, anything that would float. Some simply swam, hoisting rifles above their heads with grenades, clenched between their teeth. They crossed at night and in fog and during artillery barrages, whenever Germans couldn't see them clearly. Private Ivan Chernyshev, who survived the crossing at Kiev, remembered that the water was cold. So cold. His fingers went numb holding his rifle up. Around him, men were drowning, but they kept swimming. The commissar had said the motherland needs the western bank, so they swam. The Soviets attacked the river at countless points simultaneously. Not 10 crossings and not 50. They attempted crossings everywhere they could reach the water. By September 24th, Soviet units had established beachheads at dozens of locations along the entire front. At Novopetrovka, a Soviet battalion crossed using coffins stolen from a cemetery. At Gradisk, combat engineers lashed together a bridge from destroyed German vehicles. And near Cherkasy, an entire regiment walked across a dam the Germans had failed to demolish. Manstein couldn't respond effectively. He had one exhausted division for every 30 kilometers of river. Stopping a single crossing demanded 3 divisions concentrated at one point. The mathematics were impossible. It was like trying to stop rain with a tennis racket. He attempted it anyway. The 24th Panzer Division raced to eliminate a bridgehead at Bukrin. They arrived to find not 1 crossing but 5. The 7th Panzer counterattacked crossings near Kremenchug. While they were engaged, Soviets crossed 10 kilometers to their north and south simultaneously. Intensity medium. But Stalin demanded faster progress. He ordered the 3rd Guards Airborne Corps dropped behind German lines at Bukrin. It became a slaughter. Transport planes flew into German flak without fighter escort. Paratroopers dropped into swamps and onto German positions and into the river itself. Of 4,500 Soviet paratroopers, 900 were captured or killed within 24 hours. Their bodies hung from trees where German troops displayed them as warnings. The rest scattered into forests, hunted like animals by German rearguard units and Ukrainian collaborators. Yet even this catastrophe couldn't halt the river crossings. The failed airborne operation actually assisted the overall effort because it drew German reserves away from the river itself. Intensity high. Lieutenant Pavel Nikonov led 40 men across near Kremenchug using a stolen fishing boat. They held their bridgehead against 2 German companies for 3 days until relief arrived. Only 3 survived. All 40 became heroes of the Soviet Union, most of them posthumously. A German officer named Major Otto Kretschmer reported to headquarters that they're crossing everywhere. We shoot them in the water, and more keep coming. We race to stop a crossing in the north, and they cross in the south. We have no reserves and no ammunition. The men haven't slept in 5 days. This isn't a battle anymore. It's a nightmare. By September 30th, the Red Army had established 23 major bridgeheads on the western bank. Each one was a dagger pointed at Germany's heart. Intensity medium. Within a single week, what Berlin had proclaimed an impregnable barrier had become a sieve leaking Soviet armies. October 1943. The bridgeheads began connecting like metastasizing cancer. What started as isolated footholds merged into a continuous Soviet-controlled western bank. German counterattacks failed catastrophically. They possessed no tanks because most had been destroyed during the retreat. They had no air support because the Luftwaffe was fighting for survival over Germany itself, desperately trying to stop Allied bombers from incinerating German cities. Army Group South stretched across 700 kilometers with 1 division per 30 kilometers. Doctrine demanded 1 division per 10 kilometers maximum. The mathematics meant death. German artillery had exhausted its ammunition. Units reported expending their final shells and repurposing anti-tank guns as improvised artillery. Some positions defended themselves with captured Soviet weapons because German supply lines had completely disintegrated. Manstein transmitted desperate telegrams to Hitler, saying he cannot hold and requesting permission to withdraw to the Bug River. Hitler's response was to hold at all costs. Manstein replied that they have no reserves. Hitler said to find reserves. Manstein repeated that there are no reserves. Hitler told him to hold the line. Manstein said the line doesn't exist. Hitler ceased responding, but there was nothing left to hold with. The 24th Panzer Division possessed 8 functioning tanks and called itself a Panzer Division purely from habit. The 46th Infantry had lost 2/3 of its strength and merged with remnants of 3 other shattered divisions. Some companies were reduced to 30 soldiers commanding themselves because every officer was dead. Soviet artillery dominated the river. Thousands of guns fired day and night. The bombardments could be heard in Romania. German soldiers couldn't move in daylight. They couldn't bring forward supplies. They couldn't evacuate wounded. They could only observe helplessly as more Soviet divisions poured across their supposedly impregnable river. General Konev's troops seized Kremenchug on September 29th. Vatutin's forces encircled German units at Cherkasy, and Rokossovsky drove toward Kiev. The Wehrmacht wasn't fighting anymore. They were drowning in a red tide. Colonel Ernst von Reichenau inscribed the final entry in his unit diary. October 12th, Soviets crossing in our sector in division strength. No reserves, no ammunition, artillery destroyed, most officers dead. May God help Germany, for we cannot. A German private named Joseph remembered that they could see the Soviets constructing bridges. Hundreds of men were laboring in broad daylight. They had nothing to stop them. He fired his rifle at them until he had no bullets. Then he just watched them come. By mid-October, the Dnieper defense had collapsed entirely. The race was finished. Germany had lost. 4 million soldiers fought at the Dnieper. Approximately 450,000 were killed or listed as missing. The river flowed red for weeks. The Germans lost 400,000 men they could never replace. The Wehrmacht of 1943 perished on the Dnieper's banks. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist. The 79th Infantry Division was annihilated. The 4th Panzer Division was rendered combat ineffective. And the 8th Army was shattered beyond recognition. Veterans who survived described scenes from hell. Bodies floated downstream for weeks. The riverbanks lay carpeted with corpses. Ukrainian civilians were conscripted to excavate mass graves that extended for kilometers. The stench of death carried 20 kilometers on the wind. Soviet losses were equally staggering. Entire regiments evaporated during crossing attempts. But behind every fallen Soviet soldier stood 3 more. Behind every destroyed Soviet tank rolled 5 fresh ones from the Urals. The Red Army could absorb these losses. The Wehrmacht could not. By December, left bank Ukraine was liberated. Every major Ukrainian city east of the Dnieper flew the red flag. Kiev fell on November 6th, precisely timed for the anniversary of the October Revolution. Stalin celebrated with a 324-gun salute in Moscow. The Soviet Union had reclaimed its industrial heartland. Type Simran somber, intensity high. The human cost was inscribed in graves stretching from Kursk to Kiev. Villages that once sheltered thousands now held dozens. Fields that should have grown wheat sprouted crosses instead. The Scorched Earth campaign left millions of civilians confronting starvation. The winter of 1943 to 44 would claim nearly as many Ukrainian lives as the battle itself. Maria Petrovna, a survivor from a village near Cherkasy, remembered that first the Germans burned everything when they retreated. Then came the battle, shells day and night. Then came winter. They ate grass and bark from trees. They boiled leather shoes for soup. Half their village died, not from bullets, but from hunger. The strategic consequences proved even more devastating than the human toll. After the Dnieper, Germany never again seized the initiative in the east. Every subsequent defensive line would crumble. The Soviets had demonstrated they could shatter any German position, and the Germans had learned they could hold nothing. The Battle of the Dnieper completed what Stalingrad and Kursk had begun. the total and irreversible destruction of German power in the east. The Dnieper was supposed to rescue the Wehrmacht. Instead, it destroyed them forever. Hitler envisioned an eastern wall that would freeze the Soviet advance in its tracks. What he received was a river crossing that cost him 400,000 irreplaceable soldiers. The defensive line that existed only in his delusions became the Wehrmacht's mass grave. Intensity high. After the Dnieper, the German army never stopped retreating. From this river to Hitler's bunker in Berlin stretched one long and bloody withdrawal. Every defensive line would disintegrate. Every counteroffensive would fail. The Wehrmacht absorbed a terrible lesson at the Dnieper. They weren't an army anymore. They were simply men running west, hoping to die on German soil rather than in Russian snow. The Battle of the Dnieper proved the war was lost. Not merely the battle, and not merely the campaign, the entire war. The mathematics had become insurmountable. The Soviet Union was generating more men and more tanks and more artillery than Germany could possibly destroy. And now they demonstrated they could breach any defensive line, cross any river, and overcome any obstacle. Type reflective intensity, medium. Field Marshal von Manstein, reflecting after the war, wrote that the Dnieper was where they stopped being soldiers and became fugitives. They knew then that they would retreat until they ran out of Germany. The Eastern Wall collapsed before it was ever constructed, and with it fell any possibility of Nazi Germany surviving the war. The path from the Dnieper led inexorably to one destination, a bunker in Berlin, where a failed artist would finally comprehend that his 1,000-year Reich wouldn't survive another 1,000 hours. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more fascinating World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.